The silver handles of the casket gleamed under chandeliers that had witnessed 3 generations of family secrets, and Raphael stood close enough to touch the polished wood, but kept his hands clasped behind his back instead. His brother's face looked peaceful in death, which felt like the cruelest joke the universe could offer considering the violence that had marked his final days. The funeral home smelled of lilies and old money, that particular combination of fresh flowers and aged mahogany that only existed in establishments serving families like his. Catherine adjusted the collar of July's black dress with gentle fingers, a nervous gesture that had nothing to do with the child's appearance, and everything to do with keeping her own hands occupied. The little girl stood perfectly still during these adjustments, her dark eyes scanning the room with an intensity that seemed wrong for someone who should still believe in fairy tales. She'd lost her parents 6 months earlier in circumstances that remained carefully unexplained, and Catherine had stepped into the role of guardian without hesitation or legal formality. Raphael's eulogy drew careful lines around the truth, praising his brother's loyalty and vision, while omitting the territories fought over and the rivals eliminated. The guests understood this verbal choreography, nodding at appropriate moments while their eyes communicated what their mouths never would. Business associates stood shoulder to shoulder with legitimate investors who'd learned not to ask questions about the source of capital. The mixture of worlds created a tension that hummed beneath the surface of respectful silence. July watched a woman in the 4th row dab her eyes with embroidered linen, noting how the tears never quite reached her cheeks before being captured by expensive fabric. She'd developed this habit of observation in the month since becoming an orphan, cataloging details that adults missed because they were too busy performing grief rather than feeling it. Catherine had taught her that watching carefully could prevent hurt, that understanding who people really were offered better protection than any locked door. The room held 47 people by July's count, though she'd only been introduced to 12 of them by name and function. Raphael's inner circle formed a protective semicircle near the casket, men whose tailored suits couldn't quite hide the alertness of trained predators. Their presence suggested this funeral was also a meeting, a gathering where alliances would be tested and loyalties confirmed through simple acts of attendance. Catherine's hand rested lightly on July's shoulder, a touch that grounded without constraining, and the child leaned into that warmth while maintaining her surveillance of the room. She'd learned that safety came from knowing what was happening before it fully unfolded, from catching the tremor before the earthquake arrived. The guardian and the guarded had developed their own language over 6 months of shared grief and careful rebuilding. The funeral home itself was a monument to discretion, its stone facade hiding rooms where powerful families had mourned and plotted for over a century. Thick carpets swallowed footsteps and conversations, creating pockets of privacy even in crowded spaces. Oil paintings of stern ancestors lined the walls, their painted eyes seeming to judge the living with the same severity they'd employed during their own reigns. July found those portraits less frightening than the real faces around her, because at least painted judgment remained consistent and predictable. Raphael's voice carried the weight of authority even when softened by grief, each word chosen to convey strength rather than weakness. He spoke of his brother's dedication to family, using that loaded term that meant both blood relations and the extended network of loyalty and obligation. The men near the casket shifted their weight almost imperceptibly, recognizing the subtext that promised continuity and warned against opportunism. This moment of vulnerability was also a demonstration of control. July noticed how certain guests avoided making eye contact with Raphael, while others held his gaze for calculated seconds before looking away. These small interactions formed a map of power and submission that she was learning to read with increasing accuracy. Catherine had never explicitly taught her these skills, but the child absorbed them through proximity to a woman who'd survived by understanding unspoken rules. The funeral was less about honoring the dead than establishing terms for the living. The air conditioning hummed with expensive efficiency, maintaining a temperature that preserved flowers and comfort, while doing nothing to dispel the heaviness that grief and tension created together. Stained glass windows filtered afternoon light into colors that painted the mourners in amber and crimson. A string quartet played Vivaldi in an adjacent room, the music audible but not intrusive, providing emotional soundtrack without demanding attention. Every detail had been orchestrated to project dignity and permanence. Catherine's own black dress was simple and well-made, purchased from a department store rather than a boutique, but worn with enough confidence to blur that distinction. She'd learned to move through Raphael's world without pretending to belong to it, maintaining her own identity while respecting its particular rules. July's presence had connected them initially, the child serving as bridge between Catherine's teaching career and the darker waters where Raphael conducted his business. That connection had deepened through shared meals and quiet conversations that never quite addressed what everyone knew, but nobody said. Raphael finished his eulogy with a quote about brotherhood that sounded ancient and wise, though July suspected he'd crafted it himself that morning. The guests responded with solemn nods and murmured agreement, playing their assigned roles in this carefully staged production. His brother's death had created a wound in the organization's structure, and this gathering was the first step in either healing or exploiting that injury. Time would reveal which direction the majority chose. July's feet hurt in the new shoes Catherine had bought for the occasion, but she stood without fidgeting because she understood this was important. The adults around her were engaged in rituals that maintained order, and disrupting those rituals could have consequences that extended far beyond a scolded child. She'd become fluent in the language of silence, knowing when to speak and when to simply observe. Today was definitely a day for observation. The funeral director hovered at the room's periphery, his professional solemnity masking what July recognized as nervousness about hosting this particular family's grief. He'd probably handled hundreds of services, but this one carried additional weight that showed in the stiffness of his shoulders. Raphael's reputation preceded him into every space, coloring interactions before they even began. The director's anxiety was justified, though nothing in Raphael's demeanor suggested threat. Catherine squeezed July's shoulder gently, a wordless check-in that the child answered by relaxing slightly into the touch. They communicated this way often, through pressure and response rather than language. July had stopped asking questions about why they attended certain events, or why some of Catherine's friends spoke in hushed tones when they thought she wasn't listening. Understanding came gradually, piece by piece, like assembling a puzzle without knowing what the final image should reveal. The moment of silence that followed the eulogy stretched longer than traditional, becoming almost uncomfortable in its duration. Raphael stood with his head bowed, either genuinely praying or using the gesture to think through whatever calculations governed his next moves. The guests waited, unsure whether to break the silence or maintain it until he signaled release. July counted 17 seconds before someone coughed softly, and even that small sound seemed like a violation. Light shifted through the stained glass as clouds moved outside, changing the room's color palette from warm to cool and back again. These subtle alterations affected the atmosphere in ways July couldn't quite name, but she felt them nonetheless. The funeral was performance and reality simultaneously, genuine grief existing alongside political theater. Her young mind struggled to reconcile these contradictions, but was learning that adults lived comfortably with such paradoxes. The stranger entered through the south door during the final verse of Ave Maria, his timing either deliberately dramatic or accidentally perfect, depending on interpretation. His suit was European in cut, probably Italian given the drape of the fabric and the subtle sheen that spoke of silk blended into wool. July noticed him immediately because he moved differently than the other guests, his steps measured but not quite matching the rhythm of genuine mourning. Catherine felt the child tense slightly and followed her gaze to the newcomer without turning her head in an obvious way. The stranger was perhaps 40, with silver threading through dark hair in a way that suggested distinction rather than age. His face carried no expression that could be easily read, neutral in that specific way that required practice and purpose. None of Raphael's security moved to intercept, because the stranger wore his expensive clothing like armor, and his confidence like credentials. Raphael continued his conversation with an elderly associate, while part of his attention tracked the latecomer's progress through the assembled mourners. The man navigated the room with practiced ease, offering subtle nods to people he seemed to recognize while avoiding actual conversation. His path toward the casket was direct but unhurried, as if he had every right to be there but no particular urgency about paying his respects. July's fingers tightened slightly on Catherine's hand. The stranger paused to sign the memorial book, his penmanship visible even from a distance as bold and angular, the kind of handwriting that declared confidence. He took his time with this task, perhaps adding a message beyond just his name, though the book's angle prevented July from seeing what he wrote. The funeral director approached him briefly, an exchange of whispered words that ended with the director stepping back and gesturing toward the casket. Whatever the stranger had said satisfied protocol enough to grant him access. July counted the stranger's steps from the memorial book to the casket, 14 in total, each one placing his polished shoes precisely on the burgundy carpet runner. His hands remained visible and empty, clasped loosely in front of him, in a posture that mimicked prayer without quite committing to it. The lighting in the room made his silver hair almost luminous, creating a halo effect that seemed ironic given the setting. Catherine's breathing had changed slightly, becoming more controlled and deliberate. The man approached the casket with appropriate solemnity, standing at its foot, rather than along the side where family members had gathered earlier. He bent at the waist in a gesture of respect that seemed rehearsed, holding the position for exactly the right amount of time. When he straightened, the movement caused his jacket to shift slightly, revealing the interior pocket's contents for just a fraction of a second. July's sharp eyes caught the glint of silver, the distinctive shape of something that didn't belong in a stranger's possession. The brooch was small but unmistakable, its design featuring a crest that only family members were entitled to wear or carry according to traditions July had heard whispered about, but never fully explained. She'd seen Raphael's brother wearing something similar in photographs that Catherine kept in a drawer, mixed in with other mementos from when their lives were more entangled with this world. The piece caught light like a small sun, announcing its presence to anyone who knew what to look for. July knew instinctively that this object mattered in ways she couldn't fully articulate. Raphael had noticed the stranger now, his conversation with the elderly associate continuing on autopilot, while his real attention focused on the man at the casket. The stranger seemed aware of this scrutiny, or perhaps he'd expected it, because his movements became even more deliberate and controlled. He reached into his jacket pocket, and for a heartbeat, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, but he only withdrew a handkerchief to dab at dry eyes. The gesture felt theatrical, performed for an audience he knew was watching. July tugged on Catherine's hand, then released it to reach for Raphael's jacket sleeve instead, her small fingers finding purchase on the expensive fabric. Catherine started to redirect her, social training suggesting that interrupting Raphael during a conversation would be inappropriate, but the child's determination stopped her. July had developed an instinct for when rules should be bent, and this moment qualified. Her grip tightened with surprising strength for someone so small. Raphael glanced down at the child, his expression flickering between mild annoyance and curiosity, before settling on something like attention. July didn't speak immediately, instead using her free hand to gesture subtly toward the stranger who was now stepping back from the casket. The man's jacket had settled back into place, hiding whatever July had glimpsed, but her expression conveyed urgency that transcended words. Catherine moved closer, creating a small triangle of shared focus amid the larger gathering. The stranger turned away from the casket and began moving toward the exit, his purpose apparently fulfilled by this brief appearance. Other guests parted slightly to let him pass, responding to some quality of authority or danger that his demeanor projected. July's eyes never left him, tracking his progress with the intensity of a much older person watching something precious slip away. Raphael bent slightly, bringing his ear closer to where July could whisper without being overheard by others. Her words were barely audible even to Catherine standing right beside them, just 3 words delivered with absolute conviction and certainty. July's voice didn't waver or suggest doubt, presenting observation as fact rather than speculation. Raphael's expression didn't change dramatically, but something shifted behind his eyes, a tightening around the edges that suggested wheels beginning to turn. He straightened slowly, his gaze finding the stranger who was now near the door, almost escaped into the corridor beyond. The elderly associate Raphael had been conversing with noticed the shift in attention, his rheumy eyes following Raphael's line of sight to the departing stranger. He started to speak, perhaps to ask a question or offer information, but Raphael raised one hand slightly in a gesture that requested silence without seeming rude. The old man subsided immediately, recognizing that something significant was unfolding, even if he didn't understand its exact nature. July remained attached to Raphael's sleeve, her anchor in a situation where her size and age made her essentially invisible to most adults. Catherine's professional instincts as a teacher warred with her newer understanding of this darker world, wondering whether to pull July back from whatever was happening or trust that the child's involvement was somehow necessary. She'd spent 6 months learning that her conventional wisdom about protecting children didn't always apply in circumstances where July's observations might prevent larger harms. The child had proven remarkably adept at noticing things that adults missed, her outsider status paradoxically granting her clearer vision. Catherine chose to stay close but not interfere. Raphael made a small gesture with 2 fingers, and 2 of his security personnel detached from their positions along the wall like shadows given sudden purpose. They moved toward the exit with practiced efficiency, not running but covering ground quickly enough to intercept the stranger before he could leave the building. The other guests noticed this movement, subtle tension rippling through the gathering as people recognized that something had shifted. The funeral's careful choreography was being disrupted by forces they couldn't see, but could certainly sense. The stranger reached the doorway and was about to cross the threshold into the corridor when the security personnel arrived, positioning themselves on either side without actually touching him. Words were exchanged too quietly for July to hear from across the room, but body language told part of the story. The stranger's shoulders squared slightly, his posture changing from departure to defensive. One of the security men gestured back toward where Raphael stood, an invitation that carried the weight of command rather than request. July finally released Raphael's sleeve, her message delivered and apparently received based on the response she was witnessing. Catherine's hand returned to the child's shoulder, grounding and protective in equal measure, ready to pull her away if the situation escalated beyond talking. Raphael remained utterly still, watching the interaction at the doorway with the patience of someone who understood that power often expressed itself through waiting rather than action. The stranger looked back across the room, his eyes finding Raphael's across the distance, and something passed between them that transcended the physical space. The stranger walked back toward Raphael with visible reluctance, each step conveying that this return was compliance rather than choice, submission to authority he couldn't quite refuse. The security personnel maintained their positions flanking him, close enough to intervene if necessary, but not so close as to suggest outright imprisonment. Other guests had stopped pretending not to notice, their conversations dying mid-sentence as attention focused on this small drama unfolding. July pressed closer to Catherine, suddenly aware that her whispered observation had set something irreversible into motion. Raphael waited until the stranger stood directly before him, close enough that their conversation would remain private despite the watching audience. The elderly associate had drifted away, recognizing that his presence was no longer welcome in whatever discussion was about to occur. Catherine considered taking July out of the room entirely, but the child's hand gripped her dress with determination that suggested she needed to see the consequences of her words. The funeral director hovered nervously near the refreshment table, uncertain whether to intervene or ignore what was happening in his establishment. The stranger spoke first, his voice carrying an accent that July couldn't quite place, but that sounded like old money and European education. He offered condolences that sounded sincere enough, praising Raphael's brother's business acumen and charitable nature, with words that could have been true or completely fabricated. Raphael accepted these platitudes with minimal acknowledgement, his expression revealing nothing of what he might be thinking or planning. The security personnel remained statue still, their presence a silent reminder that this conversation was happening under duress. July noticed how the stranger's right hand kept drifting toward his jacket pocket, then stopping as if remembering something that prevented the gesture's completion. His eyes moved between Raphael's face and the security guards, calculating odds that didn't seem to favor whatever plan he might have arrived with. Sweat had begun to form along his hairline despite the room's careful climate control, small beads that caught light and betrayed nervousness his voice didn't acknowledge. Catherine felt the child's breathing quicken slightly, excitement and fear mixing in ways that worried her. Raphael let the silence stretch after the stranger finished his condolences, creating space that demanded filling with something more substantial than empty words. The funeral guests had formed a loose circle around this confrontation, curious but also wary about being too obviously interested. July counted 13 people close enough to hear if voices were raised, though everyone was pretending to examine flower arrangements or study the architectural details of crown molding. The string quartet had stopped playing, making the room's silence even more pronounced and uncomfortable. The stranger shifted his weight from one foot to the other, a small tell that suggested his confident facade was beginning to crack. He started to speak again, something about having known Raphael's brother through mutual business interests, but Raphael interrupted with a single raised hand. The gesture was minimal but carried absolute authority, stopping words mid-formation and leaving the stranger's mouth slightly open in an expression that might have been comical under different circumstances. July had never seen an adult man look quite so diminished by so small an action. Catherine's professional experience with difficult conversations had taught her to recognize when someone was about to either confess or flee. The stranger exhibited both impulses simultaneously, his body leaning slightly toward the exit, while his face tried to maintain diplomatic engagement. Raphael seemed content to simply wait, using silence as a tool that created pressure more effectively than any interrogation technique. The security personnel remained utterly motionless, breathing so shallowly they might have been carved from the same stone as the building's facade. July felt her own breath synchronizing with this tension, holding air in her lungs without meaning to. Raphael's hand moved to his own chest, fingers touching the spot where a brooch would rest if he were wearing one, drawing attention to its absence without saying a word. The stranger's eyes followed this gesture, widening slightly in recognition, or fear, or possibly both emotions blended together. His right hand completed its interrupted journey to his jacket pocket, this time actually touching the fabric where the silver glint had briefly appeared. The movement was unconscious, defensive, the kind of gesture people made when touching something precious they feared losing. July recognized that response because she did the same thing with the photograph of her parents she kept in her own pocket. The elderly associate who'd drifted away earlier had positioned himself near the exit, blocking that route with his considerable bulk, despite his advanced years. Other members of Raphael's inner circle had shifted positions as well, creating a human net that made departure impossible without explicit permission. The stranger noticed these movements, his eyes darting from face to face as he calculated how thoroughly trapped he'd become. His expensive suit suddenly looked less like armor and more like costume, something worn to play a role that was rapidly falling apart. Catherine's hand tightened on July's shoulder in preparation for whatever was about to happen. Raphael finally spoke, his voice pitched low enough that even the closest observers couldn't hear actual words, only the rhythmic cadence of questions being asked and answers being demanded. The stranger responded in the same hushed tones, his body language shifting from defensive to something approaching desperate. July strained to hear, but caught only fragments. Single words like found, and didn't know, and please, that suggested a narrative being constructed on the spot. The security personnel leaned in slightly, ready to catch confessions, or prevent escape attempts with equal efficiency. The stranger's hand moved to his jacket's interior pocket, not the one where he'd touched the hidden object, but a different one on the opposite side. He withdrew a wallet, leather so soft and worn it suggested long use, and opened it to reveal something that Raphael examined without touching. July couldn't see what identification or documentation was being displayed, but she watched Raphael's face for reaction, and found only the same impassive attention he'd maintained throughout. Whatever evidence the stranger offered didn't seem to satisfy whatever test Raphael was administering. Catherine became aware that July was no longer just observing, but actively studying every detail of this confrontation, memorizing it the way she memorized difficult spelling words or multiplication tables. The child was learning something about how power worked, how adults negotiated truth and consequences when stakes climbed beyond normal social boundaries. Part of Catherine wanted to shield July from this education, but another part recognized that the child was already too deeply immersed in this world to be protected by ignorance. Knowledge might serve her better than innocence in circumstances like these. The stranger tried a different approach, his voice rising slightly in what sounded like righteous indignation about being detained at a funeral, offended dignity that someone might question his right to pay respects. Raphael's expression didn't change, suggesting this performance was failing to achieve its desired effect. One of the security guards shifted position slightly, moving from flank to a more forward stance that transformed the conversation's geometry from interview to interrogation. The stranger's indignation deflated as quickly as it had inflated, leaving him looking smaller and considerably older than he'd appeared upon entering. Raphael made another minimal gesture, this one directed at the security personnel, and they moved with synchronized precision that suggested extensive training and shared understanding. One guard produced a phone from his jacket, speaking into it in tones too quiet to carry beyond immediate vicinity. The other maintained his position, but relaxed slightly, as if whatever crisis point had existed was now passing. The stranger sagged visibly, whatever strength had been maintaining his posture draining away like water from a cracked vessel. July felt Catherine's tension easing as well, reading the room's energy shift from potentially violent to merely severely uncomfortable. The funeral director finally approached, his professional duty to maintain decorum apparently overriding his fear of interrupting Raphael's business. He whispered something about private rooms being available if this discussion needed to continue away from other guests, his expression pleading for anything that would restore his establishment's atmosphere of dignified mourning. Raphael considered this offer for a long moment, before nodding once, accepting the suggestion with a grace that felt like a kindness to everyone present. The stranger looked toward the exit one final time, as if measuring the distance and calculating whether flight remained possible despite all evidence to the contrary. The small group began moving toward a side door that July hadn't noticed before, camouflaged by wallpaper and architectural detail to serve exactly this purpose of removing awkward situations from public view. Catherine finally made her decision, turning July away from the scene, and guiding her toward the refreshment table where coffee and cookies waited for guests who needed distraction. The child resisted briefly before complying, understanding that some lessons could only be absorbed from distance rather than proximity. She'd said her 3 words and set wheels in motion that would continue turning whether she watched or not. Raphael paused at the doorway to the private room, looking back across the gathering until his eyes found July standing beside Catherine near the cookies. Something passed between them in that glance, an acknowledgement that transcended their age difference and the gulf between their worlds. July had given him information that mattered, and he recognized the gift even if he couldn't yet understand its full implications. The child met his gaze without flinching, her dark eyes holding steady with a confidence that seemed borrowed from someone much older and far more experienced in these matters. The private room smelled of leather and cedar, walls lined with books that had never been read but served to absorb sound and create an atmosphere of serious business. Raphael directed the stranger to a chair positioned deliberately with its back to the door, while he himself remained standing near a mahogany desk that dominated the space. The security personnel took positions that blocked both exit and any potential violence, their presence transforming courtesy into captivity. The stranger sat with visible reluctance, his hands gripping the armrests as if the chair might launch him somewhere safer. Raphael pulled a photograph from the desk drawer, placing it face up where the stranger could see without having to reach for it. The image showed 2 young men in their 20s, arms around each other's shoulders, both wearing identical silver brooches on their lapels. The photographer had captured them mid-laugh, faces open and unguarded in ways that seemed impossible now that one of them lay in a casket and the other stood interrogating a nervous stranger. The brooch in the photograph caught light the same way the one in the stranger's pocket had, unmistakable in its distinctive design. The stranger's face went through several expressions in rapid succession, starting with confusion, moving through recognition, and settling on something that looked like trapped resignation. His hand moved unconsciously toward his pocket again before he caught himself, the gesture incomplete but revealing. Raphael let the photograph speak for itself, creating silence that demanded explanation for how a piece of jewelry visible in this old picture had ended up in possession of someone who claimed only casual business acquaintance. The security guards shifted their weight slightly, attentive to the stranger's every micro-expression and potential movement. Outside the private room, the funeral had resumed its careful choreography, guests returning to conversations about weather and mutual acquaintances while carefully not mentioning the confrontation they'd witnessed. Catherine kept July occupied with hot chocolate and a coloring book someone had thoughtfully provided for the handful of children present. The child colored with meticulous attention to staying within lines, but her ears remained tuned to the closed door 20 feet away. She'd started something, and waiting to see how it finished required patience that felt physically uncomfortable. The stranger finally spoke, his voice stripped of the confident tones he'd carried into the funeral home. He claimed to have purchased the brooch from an antique dealer in the city 3 weeks prior, drawn to its unusual design without understanding its significance. The story emerged in fragments, each piece sounding rehearsed, but delivered with enough nervous energy to suggest either genuine fear or excellent acting. Raphael listened without interruption, his expression revealing nothing about whether he found this explanation credible or laughably transparent. One of the security guards produced a phone, typing rapidly with thumbs that moved faster than seemed possible for someone with such large hands. He was presumably checking whether any antique dealers had reported selling such an item, or perhaps investigating the stranger's background more thoroughly. The digital age had made certain kinds of verification instantaneous, transforming investigations that once took weeks into minutes of scrolling through databases and security footage. The stranger watched this activity with growing desperation, knowing that his story would either hold up or collapse within moments. Raphael's grandfather had commissioned the brooches from a jeweler in Milan who specialized in family crests and heraldic designs, paying enough that the craftsman agreed never to reproduce the specific pattern. The 3 pieces were meant to pass down through generations, symbols of legitimacy and belonging that couldn't be forged or replicated without resources beyond most people's reach. His brother had worn his daily, even to casual meetings where its formality seemed excessive, because the weight of it reminded him who he was. That such an object could end up in an antique shop strained credibility past any reasonable breaking point. The stranger tried a different approach, suggesting that perhaps the brooch had been stolen from its original owner and sold through channels that obscured its provenance. This explanation at least acknowledged that the piece shouldn't exist in civilian hands, which represented progress toward truth, even if it didn't constitute full confession. Raphael's expression flickered with something that might have been appreciation for this tactical shift. The security guard with the phone looked up and shook his head once, conveying that whatever checks he'd run had produced no supporting evidence for the antique dealer story. Catherine noticed that July had stopped coloring, her crayon hovering above the page, while her entire body angled toward the closed door. The child possessed an almost supernatural ability to sense when important moments were unfolding beyond her sight, as if she could read vibrations in the air that adults had learned to ignore. Catherine debated taking her outside for fresh air, removing her from proximity to whatever was happening, but recognized that July would resist and possibly create a scene. Sometimes the path of least disruption meant allowing children to exist in spaces adults would prefer to shield them from. Raphael circled behind the stranger's chair, not touching him, but making his vulnerability explicit through positioning that suggested predator examining trapped prey. The stranger's shoulders hunched slightly, his body trying to make itself smaller in response to this implicit threat. One of the security guards moved to maintain triangulated positions, ensuring that escape remained impossible regardless of which direction the stranger might bolt. The room's careful quiet felt heavy, pregnant with potential violence that everyone present understood could materialize with minimal provocation. The photograph on the desk showed Raphael's brother wearing the brooch at his graduation from university, young and optimistic in ways that later years had complicated. Another picture, this one kept in Raphael's wallet, captured a family dinner where all 3 original brooches were visible on the men who'd inherited them from the grandfather who commissioned their creation. That third piece had disappeared with its owner years ago, circumstances of death unclear but consequences permanent. Now the second brooch had reappeared in the wrong hands, suggesting patterns that Raphael's instincts recognized even before his conscious mind finished assembling the evidence. The stranger's story evolved again, this time admitting that he'd received the brooch as payment for services rendered, though he remained vague about what those services entailed. This version had the ring of truth, or at least something closer to it than his previous explanations. Raphael leaned against the desk, arms crossed, waiting for more details that would either confirm suspicions or redirect his investigation. The security guard with the phone had begun recording the conversation, presumably with consent implied by circumstance rather than explicitly requested. July's hot chocolate had gone cold in its cup, forgotten while she maintained her vigil toward the private room door. Catherine touched her shoulder gently, trying to bring her attention back to the present moment and the coloring book that lay abandoned. The child turned her face up to Catherine with an expression that seemed far too adult, eyes asking questions that Catherine couldn't answer because she didn't fully understand what was happening either. They existed in the margins of Raphael's world, close enough to see its operations but not privy to its complete logic. The stranger described meeting with someone he couldn't name in a location he couldn't specify, being handed the brooch along with cash payment for facilitating a business transaction that he declined to detail. This non-explanation carried the structure of truth without its substance, revealing that something had occurred while obscuring all actionable details. Raphael recognized this technique, had probably employed it himself in conversations where disclosure carried unacceptable risks. The stranger was protecting someone, which meant that person held power over him, greater than even Raphael's current intimidation. One of the security guards left the room briefly, returning with the funeral director who carried a locked box that he opened with shaking hands. Inside, wrapped in velvet, lay another silver brooch identical to the one presumably still in the stranger's pocket. This was Raphael's own piece, the third of the original 3, kept secure during the funeral to prevent exactly the kind of confusion or theft that possession disputes might create. He lifted it out and placed it beside the photograph, creating a tableau that made the stranger's situation crystallographically clear. The stranger reached into his pocket finally, no longer pretending that he didn't possess what everyone knew was there. He withdrew the brooch with visible reluctance, placing it on the desk next to Raphael's own piece. The 2 brooches sat side by side, identical in every detail from the engraving to the slight wear patterns that decades of handling had created. Raphael picked up the stranger's brooch, examining it closely under the desk lamp's focused light, checking for any sign of forgery or reproduction. His expression shifted subtly, confirming what he'd already suspected, but hadn't wanted to believe. The stranger seemed to deflate completely now that the physical evidence lay exposed, his final protective layer stripped away. He began talking more freely, words spilling out in a confession that mixed self-justification with genuine regret. He'd been approached 6 weeks ago by someone claiming to represent business interests opposed to the family's continued dominance. The job was simple surveillance initially, tracking movements and reporting schedules, nothing that seemed particularly dangerous or morally compromised. Only later did he understand that his information was being used to plan something far more permanent than corporate espionage. Catherine saw the private room door open slightly, Raphael's silhouette visible in the gap as he looked out toward where July sat with her cold chocolate and abandoned coloring. Their eyes met across the distance, and Catherine felt the weight of unspoken questions about how much the child understood and how much damage this exposure might cause. Raphael's expression softened almost imperceptibly before he turned back into the private room, closing the door with a gentleness that seemed at odds with everything else happening. July hadn't noticed this moment, still focused on her vigil, but Catherine stored it away as evidence of something she didn't quite have words for yet. The stranger's confession unfolded like a map being drawn in reverse, starting from the present moment and working backward through decisions and compromises that had seemed reasonable at the time. He'd been paid well for his initial surveillance, money that covered debts accumulated through bad investments and worse gambling habits. The people who hired him never threatened explicitly, but their implications about consequences for failure carried weight that made refusal seem impossible. He'd convinced himself that information wasn't the same as action, that reporting someone's schedule didn't make him responsible for what others did with that knowledge. Raphael listened, while mentally cataloging every detail that might lead to whoever had orchestrated his brother's death, separating useful intelligence from self-serving rationalization. The stranger described meeting his contact in various locations around the city, always public spaces where their conversation could hide in plain sight among coffee shop crowds or museum visitors. His instructions came via encrypted messages that deleted themselves after reading, technology designed to prevent exactly the kind of evidence trail that investigators or rivals might follow. The operation had been professionally planned by people who understood operational security. The stranger had received the brooch 2 weeks after Raphael's brother disappeared, presented as both payment for completed work and insurance against his potential cooperation with any investigation. Possessing the piece made him complicit in whatever had happened, tying him to the crime through physical evidence that could place him at scenes he'd never actually visited. He'd understood the trap immediately, but took the brooch anyway, knowing that refusing would confirm suspicions about his loyalty. The people who'd hired him were thorough about creating leverage that ensured continued silence. Catherine noticed guests beginning to leave the funeral, the formal portion concluded, and the social obligations satisfied through appropriate condolences and brief conversations. July remained focused on the private room, though her attention was starting to fracture from extended waiting. The child had inherited or developed patience unusual for her age, but even that resource had limits when nothing visible was happening. Catherine suggested they step outside for fresh air, painting it as temporary departure rather than permanent exit. July resisted initially, but relented when Catherine promised they'd return before Raphael emerged. The security guard's phone investigation had revealed the stranger's financial troubles, confirming the gambling debts and failed investments that made him vulnerable to recruitment. Bank records showed deposits timed to match his description of payments received, though the money's origin was obscured through shell companies and international transfers. This kind of financial architecture required resources and sophistication that eliminated casual criminals from consideration. Whoever had planned his brother's death possessed both patience and expertise in covering tracks. Raphael asked about physical descriptions of the people the stranger had met, looking for details that might match known rivals or business associates who'd shown recent signs of increased ambition. The stranger provided descriptions that were simultaneously specific and useless, detailing haircuts and watch brands without capturing anything that would help identify someone in a crowd. His handlers had probably been hired specialists themselves, insulation layers between planners and executors. The more the stranger talked, the clearer it became that reaching the actual architects of this operation would require extensive investigation rather than simple intimidation. Outside, the afternoon air carried hints of rain that would arrive by evening, clouds gathering in ways that matched the atmosphere inside the funeral home. July stood on the steps breathing deeply, her small chest expanding with lungfuls of air that seemed to wash away accumulated tension. Catherine kept one hand on her shoulder, grounding without restraining, while watching other mourners navigate toward expensive cars. The parking lot was emptying gradually, people escaping back to normal lives where death remained theoretical, rather than immediate and complicated. The stranger mentioned that his final contact with the organization had occurred 3 days ago. A brief meeting where they'd expressed satisfaction with how everything had concluded. They'd paid him a final installment and suggested that maintaining permanent silence would benefit his health and financial stability. The threat was implicit but unmistakable, communicated through tone and implication rather than explicit words that could be recorded or repeated. He'd taken the money and agreed to forget everything, knowing that forgetting was impossible, but pretending was mandatory for survival. Raphael's phone vibrated, with a message from someone tracking down leads based on information being extracted in real time from the stranger's confession. His organization operated with efficiency that came from decades of practice in managing both legitimate and questionable enterprises. The network of loyalty and obligation that his grandfather had built still functioned, though with adaptations necessary for modern technology and regulatory scrutiny. Information flowed toward him the way water flowed downhill, naturally and inevitably. The stranger's voice had gone hoarse from talking, his earlier nervousness replaced by exhausted resignation that came from telling truths he'd hoped to carry silently. He'd known attending the funeral was risky, possibly foolish, but something had compelled him to see the results of his information gathering. Perhaps guilt, perhaps morbid curiosity, perhaps the arrogance that came from believing he'd successfully covered his tracks. The brooch in his pocket had felt like both trophy and burden, physical proof of involvement he couldn't fully acknowledge or completely deny. Catherine and July returned inside to find the funeral home nearly empty, just a few close associates lingering near the casket for final private goodbyes. The funeral director was orchestrating the closing procedures with practiced efficiency, preparing to transfer everything to the cemetery for burial. July's coloring book lay abandoned on a table beside her cold chocolate, artifacts of waiting that no longer mattered. Catherine collected these items more from habit than necessity, her teacher's instinct to clean up and restore order. Raphael emerged from the private room, looking no different than when he'd entered, his expression controlled, and his suit still perfectly arranged. The stranger followed several paces behind, with security guards flanking him. His earlier confidence completely evaporated, but his physical person apparently unharmed. Whatever interrogation had occurred had been entirely verbal, threats and pressure applied through words rather than force. The stranger's eyes found the exit, and locked onto it like drowning man seeing shore, desperate to escape, even though he probably understood that true escape was no longer possible. July watched Raphael cross the main room toward where she and Catherine stood, his path direct despite the furniture and floral arrangements that created obstacles. His security detail had taken custody of the stranger, presumably moving him to a location where more extensive conversations could occur away from the funeral home's increasingly watchful director. The brooch remained on the desk in the private room, evidence that would need secure storage and possibly analysis. What had begun as a funeral was evolving into something between investigation and reckoning. Raphael reached them and crouched slightly to bring himself closer to July's eye level, a gesture that acknowledged her contribution without patronizing her youth. He didn't thank her explicitly because that would require explaining what she'd noticed and why it mattered. Conversations inappropriate for a child regardless of her apparent sophistication. Instead, he simply looked at her with an expression that conveyed recognition and something that might have been respect. July met his gaze without flinching, understanding passing between them that needed no verbal confirmation. Catherine felt like an observer to a moment that excluded her, despite her physical presence, watching these two people communicate across vast differences in age and experience. Part of her wanted to insert herself, to mediate or moderate or simply understand what was passing between them. But her instinct suggested that interruption would be unwelcome, that this moment belonged to them exclusively. She remained still, maintaining her hand on July's shoulder as anchor, but not as leash. The funeral director approached with paperwork requiring Raphael's signature, forms that documented the day's proceedings and authorized the next steps toward burial. Raphael straightened and attended to these administrative details with the same focus he'd applied to interrogating the stranger, understanding that both mattered, though in different ways. His brother deserved proper burial according to tradition, rituals observed despite the complications that investigating his death created. The business of dying required attention to bureaucratic details that continued regardless of grief or rage. July tugged Catherine's hand, signaling readiness to leave now that her role in the day's events had apparently concluded. Catherine nodded gratefully, eager to return to their small apartment where normal routines might restore a sense of proportion to what had happened. They moved toward the exit, while Raphael remained occupied with paperwork, his focus entirely on the documents before him. Neither looked back at the other, but both carried awareness of the connection forged through whispered observation and subsequent investigation. The parking lot outside was nearly empty now, just a handful of vehicles remaining as evidence that anything unusual had occurred. Catherine's modest sedan sat in the far corner where she'd parked it hours earlier, before the funeral had transformed into something far more complicated. July climbed into her booster seat without complaint, unusual cooperation that suggested the child was as exhausted as Catherine felt. The drive home would take 20 minutes through traffic that was always heavy at this hour, time for both of them to begin processing what they'd witnessed. The apartment felt especially small after the funeral home's grand spaces, 3 rooms that Catherine had made comfortable through careful decoration and limited resources. July went immediately to her bedroom, closing the door with gentleness that suggested need for solitude rather than anger. Catherine stood in the kitchen making tea she didn't particularly want, needing the ritual's familiar movements to ground herself after an afternoon that had veered far outside normal experience. The kettle's whistle seemed too loud in the quiet space, breaking silence that had weight and texture. Raphael returned to his office rather than his residence, choosing work over the empty house that reminded him too sharply of his brother's absence. His desk held files that had been accumulating during the funeral's interruption, business matters that required decisions regardless of personal grief. But instead of opening these files, he retrieved a leather journal from a locked drawer, pages filled with his brother's handwriting from weeks before his disappearance. The entries were cryptic, using codes and references that would mean nothing to outsiders, but conveyed clear warnings to anyone familiar with their private language. His brother had suspected betrayal within the organization weeks before anything concrete materialized, instincts warning about conversations that ended too quickly when he entered rooms. The journal documented these suspicions without naming names, describing people through characteristics and behavioral patterns, rather than identities that could compromise the record if discovered. Raphael recognized several individuals from these descriptions, men whose loyalty he'd never questioned, but now would need to examine more carefully. Trust was the foundation of their world, but his brother's death proved that foundation could crack without warning. Catherine heard July's door open, and the soft pad of small feet moving through the apartment, followed by the child's appearance in the kitchen doorway. July held a shoebox that Catherine recognized as containing the few photographs and mementos salvaged from her parents' belongings after their deaths. The child placed this box on the kitchen table and began sorting through its contents with systematic precision, as if organizing external objects might help organize internal thoughts. Catherine sat down across from her, sipping tea and offering presents without questions. The stranger was being held in a warehouse that Raphael's organization owned through subsidiary companies, a space that appeared abandoned from outside, but contained a furnished office and basic amenities. His captivity was comfortable but absolute, guards rotating in shifts to ensure constant supervision. He'd been given food and water, access to a bathroom, even magazines to read while he waited for whatever came next. This humane treatment didn't reflect mercy so much as Raphael's understanding that brutality created resistance, while patient pressure encouraged cooperation. July arranged photographs chronologically on the table, creating a timeline of her short life from baby pictures through recent snapshots taken months before her parents' accident. Catherine recognized this behavior from her years teaching. Children processing trauma through organization and control of small manageable elements when larger circumstances remained chaotic. She'd seen students arrange pencils and erasers with obsessive precision after divorce announcements or sick grandparents, imposing order on whatever they could reach. July's methodical sorting served similar psychological function. Raphael's investigation team had begun tracing the shell companies that paid the stranger, following money through international banks, and holding companies designed to obscure ownership. This kind of financial archaeology required expertise and access to systems that existed in legal gray areas, favors owed and relationships cultivated specifically for moments like this. His organization employed accountants whose skills would have made them wealthy in legitimate finance, but who preferred the challenges and rewards of more questionable work. Numbers told stories if you knew how to read them correctly. The journal revealed that his brother had been considering stepping back from active leadership, contemplating retirement to legitimate business interests that would provide income without constant vigilance. This ambition had never been discussed with Raphael, kept private perhaps because it represented betrayal of their grandfather's legacy, or admission that the life they'd inherited wasn't sustainable indefinitely. The notes suggested conversations with financial advisors about transitioning assets and establishing trusts that could survive increased regulatory scrutiny. Someone had apparently decided that this planned withdrawal threatened their own interests enough to justify permanent prevention. July selected one photograph and pushed it across the table toward Catherine. an image showing her parents at some formal event where both wore elegant clothing and genuine smiles. Catherine picked it up carefully, knowing that handling someone else's memories required reverence and gentle touch. The photo captured a moment of happiness that felt both impossibly distant and somehow still present, frozen in emulsion and paper. July watched her examine the image with intensity that suggested testing whether Catherine would treat this treasure with appropriate respect. The security team reported that 2 of the individuals matching descriptions from the journal had recently made significant purchases exceeding their known legitimate income, luxury items, and property acquisitions that suggested access to substantial unreported funds. This evidence was circumstantial, but suggestive, especially combined with timeline analysis showing their absence from usual haunts during the period when his brother disappeared. Raphael added their names to a list that was growing longer, as investigation revealed previously invisible connections. Betrayal apparently had involved multiple participants, conspiracy rather than individual action. Catherine noticed that all the photographs July had selected showed moments of normalcy, birthdays and holidays, and casual weekend activities, rather than dramatic events. The child seemed focused on remembering ordinary happiness, anchoring herself to recollections of safety and routine, rather than dwelling on the tragedy that ended those patterns. This choice felt healthy to Catherine, evidence that July was processing grief in ways that might lead to eventual healing rather than permanent damage. Children possessed resilience that adults often underestimated, capacity to bend without breaking under pressures that would shatter supposedly stronger materials. Raphael's phone accumulated messages from associates offering condolences that doubled as requests for meetings where transitions of power and territory could be negotiated. His brother's death had created vacuum that nature and ambition both rushed to fill, competitors sensing opportunity in the temporary weakness that mourning represented. These messages required responses that balanced courtesy with firmness, acknowledging sympathy while signaling that weakness was neither permanent nor exploitable. The funeral had been public demonstration of continuity, but private negotiations would determine whether that demonstration translated into actual sustained authority. July began returning photographs to the shoebox with the same methodical care she'd used to remove them, each image placed with attention to avoiding bends or fingerprints. Catherine watched this ritual, understanding that its completion would signal readiness for whatever came next, whether that was conversation or continued silence. The child's need for control over small things reflected deeper need for control over a life that had become chaotic and unpredictable. Providing space for this minor mastery felt like the most useful thing Catherine could offer. The investigation team traced one of the shell companies to a lawyer who'd specialized in setting up untraceable entities for clients who valued discretion above transparency. This lawyer had appeared in previous investigations tangentially, always at the edges but never quite crossing into prosecutable involvement. His presence suggested connections to organized networks that operated across traditional boundaries between crime families and legitimate business interests. Raphael made a note to have someone visit the lawyer's office for conversation that would be polite but pointed, extracting information through implication rather than direct threats. July closed the shoebox lid and held it against her chest like a shield, physical barrier between herself and the world that had proven capable of taking away everything that mattered. Catherine recognized that gesture too, the protective clutching of precious objects that couldn't actually prevent future loss, but provided comfort through illusion of control. She reached across the table and touched July's free hand gently, connection that acknowledged vulnerability without trying to fix or minimize it. Some wounds required time and patient presence rather than immediate solutions. Raphael stood at his office window watching the city lights emerge as evening deepened into night, seeing patterns in the illuminated grid that matched patterns he was detecting in the investigation. His brother's death hadn't been random violence or personal vendetta, but calculated business decision made by people who viewed murder as acceptable cost of protecting their interests. This realization shifted his response from grief toward strategic planning, transforming mourning into motivation for actions that would be methodical, rather than emotional. Vengeance served best when delivered cold and complete, rather than hot and hasty. Catherine finally broke the silence, asking July if she wanted dinner or preferred to go straight to bed despite the early hour. The child considered this question with apparent seriousness before requesting pancakes, comfort food that represented normalcy and maternal care. Catherine smiled and began gathering ingredients, grateful for tasks that had clear steps and predictable outcome. the kitchen filled with sounds of mixing and cooking, domestic rhythms that pushed back against the day's darker elements. July watched from the table, still holding her shoebox, but some tension had left her shoulders. The stranger in the warehouse had been given paper and pen, invitation to write down everything he remembered about his handlers and the organization that employed him. His guards explained that thoroughness and honesty would be rewarded with options that incomplete or false information would foreclose. This approach worked better than threats because it gave him agency in determining his own fate, suggestion of control that encouraged cooperation. Most people preferred to believe their choices mattered, even in situations where outcomes had already been largely determined by forces beyond their influence. Catherine's apartment became an unexpected sanctuary over the following days, a space where normalcy could be practiced even if not fully achieved. She'd taken leave from her teaching position, citing family emergency with enough vagueness that her principal didn't press for details. July needed consistency more than Catherine needed the paycheck, and her savings could sustain them through several weeks if necessary. The child attended to her homework with unusual diligence, finding comfort in mathematics problems that had definite solutions and spelling words that followed predictable patterns. Raphael appeared at their door 3 evenings after the funeral, arriving without warning, but somehow not surprising Catherine with his presence. He carried takeout containers from a restaurant she recognized as expensive, the kind of place where reservations required weeks of advance notice. July looked up from her homework and smiled slightly, the first genuine expression of pleasure Catherine had seen since the funeral. Raphael set the food on their small dining table, with movements that suggested unfamiliarity with domestic spaces, a man more accustomed to being served than serving. They ate together in relative silence, conversation limited to passing dishes and commenting on flavors rather than addressing anything substantial. Catherine watched the interaction between Raphael and July, noting how the child seemed to relax in his presence despite everything his world represented. Perhaps the danger he embodied felt less threatening than the random cruelty that had taken her parents. At least his violence followed rules and logic she could potentially learn to navigate. Catherine found herself relaxing too, against her better judgment and professional training about appropriate boundaries. The investigation had progressed through channels Catherine couldn't access and wouldn't understand, resulting in consequences she preferred not to imagine. Raphael mentioned none of this directly, but his presence in her apartment suggested shifts in priorities or perspective. Men in his position didn't casually visit the homes of school teachers and orphaned children unless something had changed in how they calculated value and connection. Catherine didn't ask questions because she wasn't certain she wanted answers, preferring the ambiguity that allowed her to maintain comfortable ignorance. July showed Raphael a drawing she'd made in art class, a landscape featuring mountains and a small house with smoke curling from its chimney. He examined it with attention that seemed genuine rather than patronizing, asking about her color choices and the placement of trees in the composition. His questions suggested actual interest, or at least convincing performance of interest, treating her artistic decisions as worthy of serious consideration. The child glowed under this attention, straightening her posture and explaining her creative process with vocabulary that reflected Catherine's patient teaching. Catherine cleared the dishes while they talked, using the task as excuse to observe from slight distance. She'd spent 6 months becoming July's guardian, but had never quite achieved the connection she was witnessing between the child and this dangerous man. Perhaps orphans recognized something in each other, regardless of age difference or circumstances, shared understanding of loss that created bonds conventional relationships couldn't match. Or perhaps July simply craved male presence, father figure to replace the one torn away by accident and circumstance. Raphael stayed until July's bedtime, reading her a story from a book Catherine had purchased weeks earlier but never finished. His voice was suited to narration, deep and measured with natural sense of pacing that made even familiar tales sound fresh. July listened with eyes half closed, clearly fighting sleep, but unwilling to miss any part of this unexpected attention. When he finished and closed the book, she whispered goodnight with contentment that squeezed Catherine's heart in ways she hadn't anticipated. The child needed this, needed him, in ways that complicated Catherine's careful plans for their small, safe life. Catherine walked Raphael to the door after July had finally surrendered to sleep, both of them aware that conversation had become necessary now that the child's presence no longer prevented it. He thanked her for allowing the visit, acknowledging that his appearance had been presumptuous given their limited relationship. Catherine surprised herself by saying he was welcome any time, invitation extended before her rational mind could intervene with appropriate caution. His expression softened in response, transformation that made him look younger and considerably less intimidating despite unchanged features. They stood in the doorway longer than necessary, neither quite willing to end the moment despite having nothing specific left to discuss. Catherine became aware of his height and the expensive fabric of his suit, details she'd noticed before, but now felt different in the intimate space of her apartment's threshold. Raphael seemed similarly aware of the proximity, his usual confidence fractured slightly by circumstances that didn't follow his world's normal rules. Whatever was developing between them existed outside the frameworks either had used to navigate previous relationships, undefined and therefore both promising and potentially dangerous. He mentioned that his investigation had revealed names and connections, justice being pursued through channels that would satisfy his brother's memory without creating additional cycles of violence. Catherine understood that this was both truth and euphemism, actual progress existing alongside sanitized version appropriate for her civilian ears. She didn't challenge this careful language, because doing so would require acknowledging realities she preferred to hold at arm's length. Some truths were better received through filters that preserved plausible deniability about their harsher elements. Raphael asked if she'd considered what came next for her in July, long-term plans that extended beyond the immediate crisis of adjustment and grief. Catherine admitted that she'd been focused on surviving each day, rather than planning years ahead, teaching instinct to handle immediate needs before addressing distant concerns. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, perhaps recognizing similar patterns in his own approach to life after loss. They were both improvising through circumstances that defied preparation, making decisions based on instinct rather than strategy. The conversation drifted toward practical matters, his offer to help with expenses or connections that might ease July's transition into more stable circumstances. Catherine's pride bristled initially at implications of charity, but his phrasing avoided condescension by framing assistance as mutual benefit rather than one-sided rescue. He needed to feel useful in protecting something, and they needed resources beyond what her teacher's salary provided. The transaction benefited both sides even if power imbalances made true equality impossible. Catherine found herself accepting help she'd normally refuse, pragmatism overriding independence. He left finally, disappearing into the hallway with backward glance that conveyed reluctance rather than relief at escaping. Catherine closed the door and leaned against it, processing emotions she couldn't quite name or categorize. Her life had been carefully constructed to avoid exactly this kind of complication, teaching career and simple apartment representing safety, purchased through avoiding risk. July's arrival had disrupted that safety, and now Raphael's presence was transforming disruption into something that might eventually resemble chosen family, rather than random circumstance. The thought terrified and attracted her in equal measure. July appeared in her bedroom doorway, rubbing sleep from her eyes, drawn by some instinct that detected Catherine's emotional turbulence. The child crossed to where Catherine still stood by the door and wrapped small arms around her waist, offering comfort without words or questions. Catherine bent to return the embrace, breathing in the scent of children's shampoo and feeling her careful control crack slightly. They stood together in the dim hallway, two people learning to be family through shared loss and gradual accumulation of moments exactly like this one. The following weeks established patterns that began to feel like routine rather than temporary arrangement. Raphael visited regularly, sometimes with takeout, and sometimes with tickets to museums or performances suitable for children. July's nightmares decreased in frequency, though they never disappeared entirely, and her schoolwork showed improvement that her teachers commented on. Catherine found herself looking forward to evening arrivals that interrupted the isolation she'd grown accustomed to before becoming guardian. Her apartment felt less like refuge and more like home, distinction she'd never consciously recognized until now. Raphael's organization had identified 3 men, primarily responsible for planning his brother's death, each motivated by combination of ambition and fear about losing position as leadership potentially shifted. The investigation had been surgical in its precision, gathering evidence that would stand scrutiny from both law enforcement and internal judgment. 2 of the men had disappeared quietly, circumstances of their departures left deliberately ambiguous. The 3rd had confessed extensively before accepting exile to distant territory, where his influence couldn't threaten existing power structures. Justice had been served through methods that balanced mercy with necessity. Catherine noticed changes in Raphael during his visits, subtle shifts toward something resembling ordinary humanity rather than the carefully maintained control he'd displayed initially. He laughed more easily, especially at July's observations about her classmates and teachers, finding humor in the child's blunt assessments of adult behavior. His suits remained expensive, but he wore them with less rigid formality, loosening ties and rolling up sleeves in ways that suggested comfort rather than maintained image. These small transformations encouraged Catherine to imagine futures she'd previously dismissed as impossible fantasy. July asked one evening whether Raphael was going to become her new father, question delivered with characteristic directness that caught both adults unprepared. Catherine fumbled for appropriate response, while Raphael looked between them with expression that mixed surprise and something that might have been hope. He answered carefully that families came in many forms, not all of which followed traditional patterns, but that he intended to be present in whatever capacity felt right to all of them. July seemed satisfied with this diplomatic non-answer, returning to her drawing with the matter apparently resolved in her mind, even if the adults remained uncertain. July's teacher requested a conference to discuss the child's remarkable progress, noting improvements in both academic performance and social engagement that seemed almost miraculous given recent trauma. Catherine attended alone initially, but July insisted that Raphael should hear the positive feedback too, declaring with unusual assertiveness that he was part of her family now. The teacher's expression when Raphael arrived conveyed confusion about relationships and roles, but she proceeded professionally through her prepared comments about July's achievements. The child beamed under this praise, clearly proud of herself and eager to share the moment with both adults who'd become her anchors. The classroom walls displayed student artwork, including July's recent pieces, vibrant colors, and increasingly sophisticated compositions that reflected growing confidence and emotional stability. Raphael studied these drawings with attention that surprised the teacher, asking July about specific choices and techniques in ways that demonstrated genuine interest. Catherine watched him transform in this educational setting, dangerous man becoming supportive parental figure through simple acts of attention and encouragement. The teacher warmed to him gradually, recognizing authentic care beneath the expensive suit and intimidating presence. July had been invited to participate in the school's gifted program based on testing that revealed capabilities well above her grade level, particularly in mathematics and pattern recognition. Catherine had known the child was bright, but hadn't realized the extent of her abilities. Focus on emotional support overshadowing academic assessment. The teacher explained that July possessed rare combination of analytical thinking and observational skills that could lead to exceptional achievement with proper nurturing. Raphael and Catherine exchanged glances that communicated shared pride and determination to provide whatever resources the child needed. The conference concluded with plans for advanced placement and enrichment activities, July's educational path suddenly expanding with possibilities that required careful navigation. Raphael offered to hire tutors for subjects where July showed particular aptitude, framing the offer as investment in potential rather than charity. Catherine accepted this time without her previous hesitation, recognizing that pride served no one when resources existed to help July thrive. They were building something together, the three of them, family unit that defied conventional categories but functioned through mutual commitment and care. Walking to the car afterward, July held hands with both adults, creating human chain that felt symbolic of their evolving connections. She chattered about her excitement regarding the gifted program and her hopes to study advanced mathematics, words tumbling out with enthusiasm that had been absent for months. Raphael caught Catherine's eye over the child's head, expression conveying shared satisfaction at witnessing this joy. They'd managed something worthwhile despite the violence and tragedy that had brought them together, creating an environment where an orphaned child could not just survive but actually flourish. Catherine's apartment had gradually accumulated evidence of Raphael's presence, his suits hanging in her closet alongside her teacher's wardrobe, his books stacked on the coffee table beside her educational journals. These integrations had occurred naturally rather than through conscious decision, small surrenders of space that reflected larger surrenders of carefully maintained boundaries. July had long since stopped questioning his overnight stays, accepting his presence as normal part of their household configuration. Catherine still sometimes woke surprised to find him beside her, reality exceeding what she'd previously allowed herself to imagine as possible. The investigation's conclusion had brought Raphael a measure of peace, knowing that his brother's death had been answered appropriately according to their world's particular justice. He'd established new security protocols within his organization, promoted loyalists who'd proven themselves during crisis, and restructured operations to prevent similar betrayals. But increasingly, his focus shifted toward the domestic life he was building with Catherine and July, legitimate world offering satisfactions that his usual business couldn't provide. He'd begun considering his own eventual exit from active leadership, following the path his brother had contemplated before being prevented. July created a drawing specifically for Raphael, portrait of the three of them standing in front of a house larger than Catherine's apartment, with a garden and visible sky. She presented it during dinner with ceremonial seriousness, explaining that this represented where they should live once they were official family. Raphael accepted the drawing with visible emotion, carefully rolling it for transport with attention usually reserved for important documents. Catherine felt her throat tighten watching this exchange, witnessing how completely July had claimed them both as her people. The child's certainty was forcing them toward decisions they might have otherwise delayed indefinitely. Catherine's colleagues had noticed changes in her, commenting on improved mood and energy levels that contrasted sharply with the exhausted worry that had characterized her early months as July's guardian. She deflected questions about personal life, with vague references to things getting easier as routines established themselves. The truth was too complicated for casual conversation, too far outside normal experience to translate into break-room chat. Her principal had noticed Raphael picking them up occasionally, eyebrows raising slightly, but professionalism preventing invasive questions about the expensive cars and dangerous-looking man entering their small school's parking lot. Raphael purchased property that matched July's drawing with uncanny accuracy, house with garden and visible sky located in neighborhood that balanced safety with accessibility to good schools. He presented the purchase as investment rather than gift, suggesting they all live there while maintaining Catherine's apartment as backup if things didn't work. His careful framing respected Catherine's need for independence, while acknowledging that they'd already crossed thresholds that made such protections mostly symbolic. She agreed after token resistance, recognizing that July deserved stability this property could provide better than their cramped apartment. Moving day involved Raphael's associates carrying furniture with professional efficiency that suggested they'd handled much heavier lifting in their usual work. July directed placement of her belongings with authority that made the large men smile despite themselves, small general commanding her forces. Catherine unpacked books and kitchen supplies while watching this coordinated activity, domestic ballet performed by people whose day jobs involved considerably less wholesome tasks. The dissonance should have bothered her, but instead felt oddly appropriate. Dangerous men creating safe space through application of organizational skills usually employed for darker purposes. The new house filled with life quickly, July's laughter echoing through rooms that had stood empty awaiting purpose. Catherine established her study in a sunlit corner room, space dedicated to lesson planning and grading papers where she could maintain her professional identity. Raphael claimed the basement for his office, separation that allowed him to conduct business without exposing the household to details they didn't need. These spatial divisions honored everyone's needs, while creating shared areas where family life could unfold naturally. They were learning to live together, negotiating compromises and discovering rhythms that suited their unusual configuration. July thrived in their new environment, making friends with neighborhood children and excelling in her advanced placement classes. Her nightmares had become rare enough that weeks passed between incidents, trauma healing through accumulated days of security and love. She'd begun calling Raphael by name rather than elaborate titles, comfortable familiarity replacing initial formality. Catherine sometimes caught them in serious conversations about mathematics or logic puzzles, Raphael engaging fully with the child's racing mind. These moments confirmed what Catherine had gradually come to believe, that they'd built something real and worth protecting. Catherine and Raphael had never formally discussed the nature of their relationship, allowing it to develop through actions rather than definitions. They shared household responsibilities and parenting duties, supported each other's needs and goals, maintained physical intimacy that felt increasingly like genuine partnership. If pressed, Catherine would have struggled to name what they were, beyond two people committed to raising July while building life together. Labels seemed less important than daily reality of choosing each other repeatedly through small acts of care and consideration. The anniversary of July's parents' death approached with weight they all felt, but nobody mentioned directly. Catherine planned a quiet memorial, lighting candles and sharing stories about the people July was slowly forgetting, despite her best efforts to hold memories. Raphael contributed details about his own brother's death, offering his grief as parallel to July's loss. They created ritual together, acknowledging that pain didn't disappear, but could be honored and integrated into continuing life. July cried finally, tears she'd held back for months releasing in safe space between two adults who wouldn't be destroyed by her sadness. The evening concluded with July falling asleep between them on the couch, exhausted by emotional release, but peaceful in ways that suggested healing's progression. Catherine and Raphael remained still to avoid waking her, connected across her small sleeping form. They didn't need words for what passed between them in that moment, understanding forged through shared commitment to protecting this child who'd brought them together. Whatever they'd become, whatever labels might eventually apply, they were family in the ways that actually mattered, choosing each other daily through actions that words couldn't adequately capture. Raphael whispered that he'd been approached about selling his interests in the organization, legitimate investors offering prices that would allow comfortable retirement. Catherine's heart jumped at implications she didn't dare voice, afraid that hoping too loudly might shatter possibilities barely visible. He continued that he'd been considering the offer seriously, weighing freedom against legacy, and finding that his priorities had shifted dramatically. The life he'd inherited no longer felt like inevitable destiny, but rather choice he could decline if alternative paths presented themselves. Catherine squeezed his hand, permission and encouragement combined in silent gesture. July stirred between them, murmuring something about tomorrow's school project before settling back into sleep. They carried her to bed together, Catherine supporting her head while Raphael lifted her weight. The child didn't wake during the transfer, trusting them completely even in unconsciousness. They stood beside her bed watching her sleep, two adults marveling at the responsibility they'd somehow accepted and the love that had grown beyond anything either had anticipated. Whatever came next, they'd face it together. Family forged through tragedy but sustained through deliberate choice and accumulated care. The lawyers handling Raphael's exit from the organization worked through spring into summer. Negotiations complex but ultimately successful in transferring his interests to buyers who'd maintain operations without his involvement. The process required patience and discretion, untangling decades of complicated relationships and ensuring that his departure didn't create power vacuums that might threaten stability. His associates who'd served loyally received generous settlements, their futures secured as reward for years of service. Those who'd betrayed trust had already faced consequences, accounts settled according to rules that predated Raphael's leadership and would survive his departure. Catherine finished her school year with evaluations praising her dedication and student outcomes, professional satisfaction mixing with relief that she'd maintained teaching career despite upheavals in personal life. Her principal offered increased responsibilities for the coming year, recognition of abilities that Catherine had downplayed to avoid drawing attention. She accepted these new duties with confidence born from successfully navigating challenges far more demanding than curriculum development. Teaching remained her anchor to legitimate world, even as her home life had become entangled with considerably murkier elements. July completed her first year in gifted program, with marks that exceeded even optimistic projections, teachers commenting on her unusual combination of analytical precision and creative thinking. She'd made close friends among classmates who shared her intellectual curiosity, finding peer group that accepted her intensity rather than being intimidated by it. The shadows that trauma had cast across her personality were fading gradually, replaced by emerging confidence and genuine happiness. She'd stopped asking when her real parents were coming back, having finally accepted that Catherine and Raphael were her family now, in all ways that mattered. The house had become home through accumulation of routines and rituals, birthday celebrations and holiday traditions that created shared history. Catherine's parents visited cautiously after months of preparation, meeting Raphael with suspicion that gradually transformed into grudging acceptance based on visible evidence of July's well-being. They never fully approved of their daughter's unconventional partnership, but they couldn't deny that she seemed genuinely happy for first time in years. July charmed her new grandparents through direct questions and honest observations that made them laugh despite their initial reservations about the situation. Raphael's transition to legitimacy wasn't without complications, old associates occasionally appearing with requests for favors or advice that required delicate refusals. He'd established boundaries that protected his new life, while maintaining enough connection to prevent complete rupture from communities that had defined his previous existence. Catherine worried during these interactions, but trusted his judgment about managing risks she couldn't fully assess. Their relationship required this kind of trust, acknowledging that he possessed expertise in areas where her understanding would always be limited and incomplete. July asked increasingly sophisticated questions about Raphael's past work, her sharp mind detecting inconsistencies between official stories and underlying realities. They'd agreed to be honest with her in age-appropriate ways, rather than constructing elaborate fictions that would eventually collapse. Raphael explained that he'd worked in family business that sometimes operated outside legal boundaries, decisions made that prioritized loyalty over law. July absorbed these admissions with equanimity, asking clarifying questions, but not seeming particularly troubled by revelations. Her own experiences had taught her that adults occupied morally complex territory, simple categories of good and bad insufficient for describing actual human behavior. Catherine's relationship with Raphael deepened beyond initial attraction into something resembling genuine partnership, tested by daily challenges and strengthened through accumulated problem-solving. They'd learned each other's communication styles and emotional triggers, developing shortcuts and signals that allowed efficient navigation of potential conflicts. Their physical relationship had evolved similarly, initial urgency maturing into comfortable intimacy that reflected trust built through time, rather than mere passion. She'd stopped second-guessing the decision to build life with him, accepting that unconventional didn't mean wrong. The anniversary of the funeral arrived with less weight than expected, marked by quiet dinner rather than elaborate ritual. They'd all moved forward enough that looking backward required conscious effort rather than happening automatically. Raphael's brother's death would always matter, but it no longer defined every moment or decision. Catherine understood this shift represented healthy grief progression, integration rather than elimination of loss. July seemed similarly settled, her parents' memory preserved but not preventing her from embracing current happiness. Raphael proposed during an unremarkable Tuesday evening while helping July with mathematics homework, questions slipping out between explanations of algebraic concepts. Catherine laughed at the timing, characteristic lack of romantic staging somehow perfectly appropriate for their practical partnership. Her answer was yes, without hesitation or drama, acceptance of what they'd already been building, rather than sudden shift in trajectory. July applauded this development enthusiastically, immediately beginning to plan wedding that she insisted must include specific color schemes and elaborate cake designs. They indulged her fantasies while privately agreeing to something simpler that matched their actual preferences. The wedding occurred in their garden 3 months later, small gathering of Catherine's family and friends, plus handful of Raphael's former associates who'd earned continued trust. July served as flower girl with seriousness that made guests smile, performing her duties with focus usually reserved for important examinations. The ceremony itself was brief, vows exchanged that emphasized commitment to daily choosing rather than romantic abstractions. Catherine wore simple dress that suited her practical nature, while Raphael's suit was elegant but understated. They were promising to continue what they'd been doing, making official what had already become their reality. July's speech at the reception demonstrated her remarkable observational skills, noting how Raphael and Catherine balanced each other's tendencies and created an environment where she could feel safe again after losing everything. Her words moved guests to tears, child's perspective cutting through adult cynicism to identify essential truths about love and family. She concluded by thanking them for choosing her as much as each other, recognizing that their family had been deliberately constructed rather than accidentally formed. The applause that followed mixed appreciation for her eloquence with emotional response to her vulnerability and strength. Catherine's teaching colleagues attended, curiosity about her mysterious partner finally satisfied through direct observation. They found Raphael charming when he chose to be, capable of making conversation about educational policy and curriculum development, despite his vastly different professional background. He'd done research specifically to engage meaningfully with people important to Catherine's professional life, effort that touched her more than romantic gestures would have. These small demonstrations of care characterized their relationship, practical considerations elevated to expressions of love through attention and follow-through. The evening ended with July sleeping on Raphael's shoulder, while he and Catherine slow danced to music playing from portable speakers. Other guests had departed, leaving just the three of them in garden illuminated by strings of lights that would stay up permanently because July loved them. Catherine rested her head against Raphael's chest, feeling the steady rhythm of his heartbeat and the weight of their sleeping child between them. They swayed without speaking, tired and content, and fully present in moment that represented everything they'd built from components of tragedy and loss. The following months brought continued adjustment as they learned to be married, rather than merely cohabitating partners. The legal paperwork had been complicated by Raphael's past, background checks and documentation requirements that tested patience of everyone involved. But eventually, all formalities were satisfied. July's adoption finalized simultaneously, with the marriage certificate. They were official family now, recognized by state and federal authorities as legitimate unit. The papers felt less important than the daily reality they'd been living, but they provided security that protected against potential challenges to their unconventional structure. July's continued development exceeded all projections, her gifts becoming more apparent as she advanced through increasingly challenging coursework. Catherine and Raphael attended parent-teacher conferences where educators spoke enthusiastically about her potential trajectory, suggesting possibilities that included early college admission and specialized programs. They listened carefully while privately agreeing that July's happiness mattered more than achievement, that pushing her toward exceptional outcomes could sacrifice the stability she'd worked hard to regain. Academic success would mean nothing if it came at cost of her emotional well-being and childhood joy. Raphael's legitimate business ventures prospered, investments and consulting work generating comfortable income without requiring the constant vigilance his previous life had demanded. He'd discovered aptitude for strategic planning that translated well into legal contexts. Skills honed through managing criminal enterprises now applied to helping companies navigate competitive markets. Catherine sometimes forgot entirely about his past. So completely had he transformed into successful businessman and devoted parent. Then something would happen, shadow crossing his expression or particular phone call handled with unusual privacy, reminding her that reinvention didn't erase history even when it created genuinely new present. Catherine's own career had advanced through combination of skill and the confidence that stable home life provided. She'd been appointed department head, responsibility that carried both additional work and increased influence over educational policy in her school. The position suited her, allowing her to implement ideas she'd developed over years of classroom experience. Raphael supported these professional ambitions without reservation, handling increased household duties during periods when her work demanded extra hours. They'd achieved genuine partnership, each supporting the other's goals while maintaining their own identities and aspirations within their family structure. July created a new drawing for the anniversary of the day she'd whispered those 3 words at the funeral, artwork showing 3 figures standing together with brightness radiating around them. She explained that this represented how she felt now, surrounded by light and safety after a period of darkness and fear. Catherine and Raphael hung the drawing in their bedroom where they'd see it daily, reminder of journey that had brought them together and what they'd managed to build. The child who'd noticed a detail that changed everything had become the center around which they'd constructed their family, her sharp eyes and whispered observation the beginning of something none of them could have predicted, but all of them had chosen to nurture into permanence. Thank you all for following this story. If you've enjoyed it, write in the comments where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this video. Your support means everything, and helps me continue bringing these stories to you. Until next time, remember that sometimes the smallest observations can change everything, and family isn't always about blood, but about who chooses to stay.